Professor Turner, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your latest research looking at citizenship in Asia and specifically the issue of Sharia law?
Well, as you know, I'm broadly interested in the history of citizenship and its nature, and I've done research and published various books on citizenship in Europe. I mean, I've written about citizenship in Latin America and increasingly interested in citizenship issues in Asia. But the specific project I've been working on is Sharia law, and we've just got this grant from the ARC to look at basically Sydney and New York, which we've chosen because they're global cities. They both have large Muslim populations, and they have some things in common in terms of law, but also some things that are quite different. I mean, the American case is complicated because of the dominance of the Supreme Court and the view in America that judges should not refer to any other legal system in making judgments, whereas most legal philosophers say that modern societies are legally plural, or they're characterized by legal pluralism, and that is that if you take Europe, you've got in England, you've got common law, you've got human rights law, you've got European legislation, you've got commercial law that's transnational and so forth. And so the question is whether liberal democracies can accept Sharia as an example, as part of the growth of legal pluralism. And I think the growth of Sharia is a good test of questions about multiculturalism, integration, citizenship, and so forth, because I'm interested in what are the limits to multiculturalism. And I mean, we've had this debate about the veil, and you might say in France, for example, that the veil is a marker of what the limitations of French Republican version of multiculturalism could be. But I think the Sharia is a much deeper question about the limits of multiculturalism, because it goes to the root of questions about national sovereignty and so forth. And what we're trying to establish in these two case studies is the fact that those states that try to suppress Sharia will only have like an informalization of Sharia. That is, Sharia will operate without any transparency. It will be conducted in a kind of semi-informal and secretive way. Whereas if Sharia is recognized, and it normally operates only in the area of domestic issues, you might be able to embrace a kind of modernized form of Sharia that would be more transparent and would give women equal rights and so on. And it wouldn't really impinge upon people's freedom to exercise their religious freedoms and so forth. Whereas in America, several states, and I hope I'm going to get this correct, Oklahoma, Arizona, and I think one other have come out already with what you might call preemptive legislation to block Sharia before it even arrives. So you've got politicians like Newt Gingrich saying that if you're an American, you can't support Sharia, so making it a kind of test of patriotism. And I mean, these anti-Sharia preemptive legislation is in states that really have no Muslim population anyway, so it's kind of, that's one interesting aspect of this research. And the second thing that's quite interesting is that most societies accept Arabic banking, Islamic banks, and what people don't realize is that Sharia banking is part of Sharia law, you see. So in Britain, for example, when the Archbishop of Canterbury made this famous speech or lecture, Gordon Brown, who was at the time the British Prime Minister, came out in Parliament and said, under no circumstances would the British legal system ever accept Sharia. However, we're quite happy with Sharia-compliant mortgages. In other words, that I think in liberal capitalist societies, they're quite happy to have Sharia banking, Sharia merchandise, Sharia transactions and mortgages and all the rest of it, because that's compatible with the economic kind of base of the society. But they're very hostile to anything that smacks of, the kind of the contamination of their legal system. And what we're looking at, we're trying to collect legal cases where judges have to make reference to Sharia because they're dealing with international marriages, for example. So in America, I mean, there's one right-wing research group found 54 cases where American judges had referred to Sharia, typically in international marriages, where a couple had arranged a marriage in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, one of the members of that marriage ends up in America, and then there's a divorce. And in order to sort out the property relations, often the judges have to refer to Sharia arrangements. And so they're kind of already beginning to address Sharia issues. And there's some very good legal arguments from academics in America talking about an official Islam that's being kind of constructed by the law, where secular judges within the American system are actually kind of fashioning an acceptable form of Sharia within the legal system. I don't know, I'm sort of still uncertain in my own mind about how far citizenship, if you have a common citizenship, which America obviously does, I mean, to what extent you could have multiple forms of law. I mean, typically what you've got is not legal pluralism, but a kind of hierarchy in which, you know, for example, the House of Commons, the Parliament, actually still controls the law, but you could have like kind of components of law. And in Britain, for example, Scottish law is closer to Roman continental law than the common law tradition of England. You know, so for example, if Scotland became independent in 2020, which some people are talking about, it might be part of a United Kingdom still, but with its own kind of legal system. And just finally, because you know I've been speaking without interruption, I mean, could you have a different taxation system, for example? I mean, you know, people are taxed at different levels, but it's still within a kind of uniform taxation system. And so how far could you push? I mean, is citizenship disintegrating? Because you've got, you know, people like Kimlicka talking about, you know, people have group rights. And then some countries are quite laid back about veiling. Some countries are now accepting Sharia banking, you know, perhaps they could accept Sharia courts. And in America, for example, another contradiction is that you have Jewish courts, you've got Catholic canonical courts, but they're very hostile to the idea of Sharia courts. And the thing is, there's an interesting similarity between Jewish law and Islamic law, which is that a Jewish woman can't claim to be legitimately divorced until the husband accepts the divorce. It's called the gek. So you have a lot of women who, in Jewish communities, who are divorced in a civil court, whose divorce is rejected by the husband, and therefore the children are regarded as illegitimate by the Jewish community. In the same way, in some Muslim communities, you'll have a similar kind of situation, whereas unless the husband can be convinced by an imam council to accept the divorce, that the woman is still regarded as not, in a religious sense, divorced, I think. And perhaps just finally, what I like to do next is a study of marriage, because what seems to me to be arising here is this is also, I think, related to the transitional nature of modern marriage, that we're moving away from, you know, the idea of the nuclear family as held together by religion and the state as the ideal unit for, you know, training citizens, having children and reproducing and so forth too. I mean, the debate, I think, about same-sex marriage is the next test for, you know, ideas about citizenship and so forth. And my view is that, you know, since in New York they've now accepted same-sex marriage as legitimate, because why would the law distinguish between a contract between a man and a woman and a man and a man? Why not accept polygamy? You know, I mean, from a religious point of view, I mean, perhaps polygamy is more acceptable than same-sex marriage. I mean, at least you've got men and women, you know, in a sort of marital relationship. And so, I think the next stage of this research really, I think, would be a project on the transition of marriage in this kind of environment. And it's interesting here in Australia that, you know, in the last few days or weeks, we've had this kind of polarization of the churches around them. Some you know, Christians will accept same-sex marriage and fundamentalists won't, and so forth. In America, you know, I think the Episcopal Church in America is going to bless same-sex marriages, whereas the Southern Baptists won't. And so you might get a strange alliance between, you know, Islamic traditionalists and, you know, Christian and Jewish traditionalists lining up against, you know, same-sex marriages. I think would be quite an interesting issue.
So do you think this challenge of introducing Sharia law is more political than legal, or do you think it's legal in nature as well?
Well, I think, frankly, the Republican Party in America jumped on the issue because, you know, I mean, Americans are no longer worried, well, they're not worried so much about a communist invasion, but now they've got another kind of outsider to worry about. I mean, and the veil, interestingly enough, actually, the veil really wasn't a debate in America. I mean, it was a big issue in France because the Republican notion of secularism ruled out religious imagery in public spaces, in principle anyway. I don't think it was such a big issue in Britain, and it hasn't been all that prominent in America. I mean, the two issues in America have been Sharia, I think partly because of this Supreme Court issue, and partly because of the legacy of 9/11. I mean, the big issue in New York was Ground Zero, obviously, and that whipped up quite a lot of hostility. And I think because of the ongoing war in Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth, that, I mean, and it's a complicated issue because you've got left-wing feminists who are, recently up in arms about the shooting of the woman alleged to be in a relationship with a Taliban leader. And then you've got sort of, Republicans and Southern Baptists mobilized against Sharia, I think, as a kind of symbolic issue about insiders and outsiders. And I think it's wrapped up with the problem about migration and illegal migration and so forth. And Obama, I think, is an interesting position because, he's recently given status to people who weren't registered. And so I think there's something like 11 million people who now have more secure membership. And so I think at the moment, it's all going to depend on whether Obama wins or Mitt Romney wins. I think if Romney wins, I think he will be pushed by the Tea Party, lobby groups in Congress to take a much tougher lines about migration, and that will involve Muslim people. But could I just say this, that I think up until 9/11, Muslims are actually very well integrated into America in general. I mean, leaving to one side black Muslims and, the Nation of Islam, which was to do with race as much as anything else. I mean, Muslims generally have a higher education than the average American and a higher income level, so they're very different from the Bangladeshi and Pakistani migrants to Britain, and very different from the North African migrants to France. And I think, again, in Australia, you see the data seems to suggest that Muslims actually here are quite well educated and quite well, they have quite good social mobility. They're not that marginalised in a sense. But I think the international problem about terrorism constantly raises this issue about whether they're loyal citizens. And so we come back to the problem of citizenship again, I think.
Yeah. So your latest work is researching society. Can you tell us a little bit about your latest book, which is, I think, a history of society?
I edited a book on globalisation, but perhaps I can just advertise something. Anthony Elliott's here at Flinders University, and I just published a book on, it's called On Society, and it's at one level it's about the history of the word society. And it's to do with a citizenship issue, because we feel that the idea of society has been attacked or eroded in many ways. I mean, famously it goes back in some sense to Mrs. Thatcher's comment that there's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families and so forth. And in this book we make maybe a rather crude distinction between what we call sticky societies and elastic societies. Sticky societies are ones which are difficult to join, costly as membership and very costly to leave. So again, you could think of fundamentalist religious groups as being sticky. Whereas I think most people in a globalised environment live in very elastic societies, that is, that they have low commitment and the costs of moving in and out of social groups are very low. And so I think the very rich in modern society, the so-called 1%, are kind of members of an elastic society, because when things go wrong in Greece or Spain or Russia, they just up and move, you see. So London is now full of elastic elites from Greece, Italy, Spain, Russia and so on and so forth, leaving behind the unemployed, the underemployed, and they cannot be employed. And so we're looking, I mean, finally, the other research project I have is on Occupy Wall Street, and we're kind of looking at the whole debate about 1% and 99%, and specifically about the role of religious groups in Occupy Wall Street, because what we've discovered is that actually there's quite a high level of religious involvement, providing accommodation, space, publicity and so forth for Occupy Wall Street. So I'm interested in to what extent religious groups will become hostile to globalized capitalism insofar as it reduces employment. And the financial crisis in America, I think, has demonstrated this very well, that what we've got is a jobless recovery, to quote Stanley Aronovich, who predicted this, that, the ups and downs of the economy doesn't mean to say that you've got, a whole burst of new employment. And so the easing economic strategies in America haven't produced a sustained growth in employment. So I'm interested in, it goes back to citizenship again. I mean, to what extent we can have viable citizenship with, in Greece, something like 50% of young people unemployed.